When Magdalena Reeves collapsed in the snow after giving birth alone during a brutal Montana blizzard, her newborn silence meant death was winning, until a lonely lumberjack's desperate efforts brought the tiny lungs to life. But as Elias Thornwood carried the widow and her baby to safety, neither realized that the men riding toward them through the storm would force them to choose between a marriage of convenience and losing everything they'd fought to protect. Could two broken souls become each other's salvation, or would the ghosts of their past destroy their only chance at redemption? The baby wasn't breathing. Magdalena Reeves pressed her ear against the tiny chest, listening for any sound of life while blood soaked through the quilts beneath her. Outside her cabin, the Montana winter howled like a wounded animal, and she knew no one would come. Not tonight, maybe not for days. She had screamed until her voice cracked, hoping someone might hear. But the nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away, and this storm would keep even the bravest souls by their fires. Her husband Thomas had been dead 3 months now, killed when his horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and rolled over him. She'd been managing alone ever since, growing bigger with child and smaller with hope. Now the baby lay silent in her trembling hands. "Please," she whispered to the empty room. "Please don't leave me too." The December wind of 1867 cut through the Montana territory like a knife made of ice. Snow piled against the cabin walls, and Magdalena could hear the horses in the corral making frightened sounds. They knew something was wrong. Animals always knew. She tried everything she could think of, rubbing the baby's back, breathing into the tiny mouth, pressing gently on the small chest. Nothing worked. The little girl just lay there, blue around the lips, connected to Magdalena by a cord that felt like the last thread holding her to sanity. 3 hours earlier, the pains had started while she was cooking dinner. She'd felt babies kick before. This was her second pregnancy, though the first had ended in heartbreak when she was only 4 months along. But these pains were different, sharp, demanding. They came faster and harder until she could barely stand. She tried to heat water like she'd seen the midwife do when other women gave birth. But the contractions doubled her over before she could get the big pot on the stove. Instead, she'd crawled to the bed and waited, alone, for whatever would happen next. The cabin felt enormous and tiny at the same time. Enormous because she was so alone. Tiny because the walls seemed to press in with each gust of wind. Thomas had built it small on purpose, easier to heat, he'd said. Now it felt like a trap. She thought about her sister back in Ohio, who'd begged her not to come west. "Montana's no place for a woman," Sarah had said. "Nothing but wilderness and wild men and winters that kill." But Thomas had dreams of land and lumber, of building something that would last. Now he was buried under 6 feet of earth, and his dreams lay as cold as his body. The baby stirred. Just a flutter so small Magdalena thought she'd imagined it. Then came a sound, barely there, like a kitten's mew. The tiny chest rose and fell once, then stopped again. "No, no, no," Magdalena whispered, lifting the baby closer to her face. "Come on, little one. Stay with me." She breathed into the baby's mouth again, tasting the metallic tang of birth and fear. This time she felt something different. A response. The smallest puff of air against her cheek. Outside, something crashed, probably a tree branch heavy with snow. The sound made her jump, and she clutched the baby tighter. How long had she been in labor? Hours? Felt like days. Time moved strangely when you were alone with pain and terror. The baby's skin was getting colder. Magdalena wrapped her in the cleanest cloth she could find, then pulled both of them under the heavy quilts her mother had made. Body heat, that's what newborns needed most. She'd learned that much from helping neighbors with their babies back in Ohio. But it might not be enough. The cabin was cold despite the fire, and she was losing blood faster than she'd expected. Her vision blurred at the edges, and she felt dizzy. If she passed out now, they'd both die. The baby would freeze, and she'd bleed to death before morning. She needed help. But who would venture out in this storm? The nearest town was 15 miles away, and the roads were already impassable before the snow started falling. Even if someone tried to reach her, they'd never make it through the drifts. The baby made another small sound, stronger this time. Magdalena looked down and saw tiny fingers curl into a fist. The lips were still blue, but the chest was moving more regularly now. Maybe there was hope after all. Then she heard something that made her heart stop. Footsteps. Heavy boots on the porch stomping off snow. "Hello?" A man's voice called. "Anyone there?" I heard screaming. Magdalena tried to answer, but only a whisper came out. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Help me," she called. "Please help me." The door opened, letting in a swirl of snow and wind. A large man stepped inside, shaking ice from his coat. He had a thick beard and kind eyes, and he looked around the cabin quickly, taking in the scene. "Sweet Jesus," he said softly. "Ma'am, I'm Elias Thornwood. I was cutting timber up the ridge when I heard you calling out. Are you?" He stopped when he saw the baby. "Is that?" "She won't breathe right," Magdalena said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." Without hesitation, Elias crossed the room and knelt beside the bed. His hands were enormous, scarred from years of working with axes and saws, but they moved with surprising gentleness as he examined the baby. "She's breathing," he said. "Just weak. Sometimes they need help getting started." He looked at Magdalena with concern. "How long have you been alone like this?" "Since it started. Hours, I think." The room spun slightly, and she gripped the quilt tighter. "My husband died. There's no one else." Elias nodded grimly. He'd seen enough frontier hardship to know how quickly things could go wrong for a woman alone. "Well, you're not alone now," he said firmly. "Let me see what I can do." Elias Thornwood had been cutting trees in the Montana wilderness for 15 years, but he'd never heard anything like the screams that cut through the blizzard that morning. He'd been working alone, as usual, splitting logs for the lumber mill in Copper Falls. His partner Jacob was supposed to meet him, but the storm had come up fast and mean. Smart men stayed inside when the weather turned this ugly. But Elias wasn't known for being smart, just stubborn. The first scream made him drop his axe. It came from somewhere down the ridge, carried on the wind like a prayer for help. Then it came again, higher and more desperate. Elias knew that sound. He'd heard it once before, years ago, when his own wife was dying in childbirth back in Illinois. The sound of a woman fighting for 2 lives instead of 1. He grabbed his horse and headed toward the noise without thinking. His bay gelding didn't want to go. Horses were smarter than men about storms, but Elias forced him through the deepening snow. Each step was harder than the last, but he kept following the sound until it led him to a small cabin tucked against a stand of pine trees. The screaming had stopped by the time he reached the door. That scared him more than the noise had. Now, kneeling beside the bed where a young woman lay pale and exhausted, he understood why the silence had frightened him. She was barely conscious, and the baby in her arms looked more dead than alive. But both were breathing, and that meant there was still time. "What's your name?" he asked gently, checking the baby's color. Still too blue, but better than when he'd first arrived. "Magdalena Reeves," she whispered. This was supposed to be my daughter." "Still is," Elias said firmly. "She's just taking her time deciding whether she wants to stick around." He lifted the tiny girl carefully, supporting her head. Sometimes babies need a little encouragement. He'd learned about newborns the hard way, during the worst week of his life 5 years ago. His wife Maria had given birth to their son during a prairie storm, with only Elias to help. The baby had come early and weak, struggling to breathe just like this one. Maria had died 3 days later from fever, but little David had lived for almost a year before pneumonia took him too. Elias pushed those memories away and focused on the child in his hands. This baby was different. This baby was going to live. He rubbed her back in small circles the way he remembered doing with David. Then he breathed gently into her mouth, just enough to fill her tiny lungs without forcing too much air. After a few tries, she responded with a stronger cry. "There you go," he murmured. "That's what we want to hear." Magdalena struggled to sit up. "Is she?" "She's fine. Just needed some help getting started." Elias wrapped the baby carefully and handed her back. "But you're not fine. You've lost a lot of blood, and this cabin's too cold. We need to get you somewhere warm." I can't leave, Magdalena protested weakly. This is my home. Elias looked around the small cabin. It was neat and clean, but he could see the problems. The fire was dying because she hadn't been able to tend it. The windows were poorly sealed, letting in drafts. And most importantly, she was alone. No family, no neighbors close enough to help if something went wrong. Ma'am, he said carefully, I live about 2 miles from here, in a bigger cabin with a good stove and plenty of firewood. You and the baby need warmth and care. I can provide both. Magdalena studied his face. He was older than her husband had been, maybe 40, with gray streaking his brown hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years in the sun and wind. But his voice was kind, and his hands had been gentle with her daughter. I don't know you, she said. No, you don't. I'm just a man who cuts trees and minds his own business. But I heard you calling for help, and I'm offering what I can. He paused. Truth is, I've got room and supplies for 3 people, but I've been living alone since my family died. Maybe we can help each other. Outside, the storm was getting worse. The wind shook the cabin walls, and snow was piling up against the windows. Even if the weather cleared tomorrow, it would take days for the roads to become passable again. What would you want in return? Magdalena asked. Nothing you're not willing to give, Elias replied. Just company, maybe some cooking and mending if you're up to it. I'm not asking for anything improper. Just 2 people helping each other get through winter. The baby started crying. A good, strong sound that filled the small cabin. Magdalena tried to comfort her, but her own weakness made everything difficult. She needed help and she needed it soon. All right, she said finally, but I want to come back here in the spring. This was my husband's land, and I won't give it up. Fair enough. Elias stood and began gathering her things. Clothes, blankets, anything she might need. Can you travel? It's not far, but the snow's deep. I can manage. Magdalena wrapped the baby tightly and struggled to her feet. The world spun for a moment, but she steadied herself against the wall. Elias had brought his horse up to the porch, and he helped Magdalena climb into the saddle. She held the baby close while he led the horse through the storm, breaking trail through snow that reached his knees. The wind tried to steal their warmth, but Elias kept them moving toward the promise of safety. His cabin appeared through the snow like salvation, larger than hers, with smoke rising from a stone chimney and windows that glowed with warm light. Elias helped her down and led her inside, where a fire crackled in a proper fireplace and the air smelled of coffee and wood smoke. This is home, he said simply. Make yourself comfortable. As Magdalena settled into a chair by the fire, holding her daughter close, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Hope. The baby was breathing normally now, pink and warm and alive. And this stranger, this Elias Thornwood, had asked for nothing except the chance to help. Maybe, she thought, they really could help each other through the winter. But first, she had to survive the night. The baby wouldn't stop crying, and Magdalena was starting to panic. For 3 days, little Rosa had been perfect. Sleeping, eating, growing stronger in the warmth of Elias's cabin. But now, at 2 in the morning, she screamed like something was terribly wrong. Magdalena paced the floor, trying everything she could think of. Feeding didn't help. Rocking didn't work. Even singing the lullabies her own mother had used made no difference. Maybe she's sick, Magdalena whispered to herself, feeling Rosa's forehead for fever. The baby's skin felt normal, but what did she really know about babies? Her first pregnancy had ended too early to learn these things, and Thomas had always planned to find a doctor when their time came. Elias appeared in the doorway, his hair messy from sleep. He'd given Magdalena his bed and made himself a place on the floor by the fire, insisting it was more comfortable than it looked. Now he watched her struggle with tired eyes full of concern. She fed an hour ago? He asked quietly. Yes, and she seemed fine. Then this started. Magdalena's voice cracked with worry. What if something's wrong inside? What if I hurt her somehow when she was born? You didn't hurt her. Elias moved closer, studying the baby's face. May I? Magdalena hesitated, then handed Rosa over. She'd been caring for her daughter alone since birth, afraid to trust anyone else with something so precious. But watching Elias hold the tiny girl with practiced ease reminded her that he'd saved Rosa's life once already. The moment Rosa settled into his large hands, her crying softened to small hiccups. "She's not sick," Elias said, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. "She's lonely." Lonely? Babies need to feel safe. For 9 months, she was never alone. Always hearing your heartbeat, feeling you move. Now the world's too big and quiet. He positioned Rosa against his chest, where she could hear his heart beating. Sometimes they just need to know someone's there. Within minutes, Rosa was asleep, her tiny fist curled against Elias's shirt. Magdalena stared in amazement. She'd been trying for hours to comfort her daughter, but this man had solved the problem in seconds. "How did you know that?" she asked. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I had a son once, David. He was born early like Rosa, and he cried the same way those first few weeks. My wife Maria taught me that trick." It was the first time he'd mentioned his family. Magdalena had wondered about the extra cradle in the corner, the small clothes folded in a chest, the toys carved from wood that looked too old to be recent work. "What happened to them?" she asked gently. Fever took Maria 3 days after David was born. The baby lived almost a year before pneumonia got him too. Elias's voice stayed steady, but his eyes showed old pain. "That was 5 years ago. Haven't talked much about it since." Magdalena felt her throat tighten. Here was a man who'd lost everything, yet he'd opened his home to strangers without question. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be. They're gone." But knowing how to help Rosa, that's something good coming from something bad. He carefully transferred the sleeping baby back to Magdalena. "She'll probably sleep better next to you. Babies like to know their mothers are close." As Magdalena settled Rosa in the cradle beside the bed, she realized something had changed between her and Elias. He wasn't just a kind stranger anymore. He was someone who understood loss, who knew what it meant to love something so much that losing it nearly destroyed you. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Magdalena was feeding Rosa when she heard horses approaching. Through the window, she saw 3 men riding up the snowy path, their faces hidden by thick scarves. Her stomach clenched with sudden fear. Out here, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. Elias emerged from the barn where he'd been feeding his animals. Even from inside the cabin, Magdalena could see the tension in his shoulders as he walked toward the riders. "Morning, Thornwood," the lead rider called, pulling down his scarf to reveal a thin face and sharp eyes. "Heard you had company." "News travels fast for a blizzard week," Elias replied carefully. "What brings you out, Morrison?" "Samuel Morrison." Magdalena recognized the name if not the face. Thomas had mentioned him several times, always with worry in his voice. Morrison owned the bank in Copper Falls and had a reputation for buying up land from families who couldn't pay their debts. "Looking for Mrs. Reeves," Morrison said, his gaze moving past Elias to the cabin. "Heard she had her baby and might need assistance." "She's fine," Elias said firmly. "Got everything she needs." "I'm sure she does, but there's the matter of her late husband's debts. Can't let those slide just because of personal tragedy." Morrison's voice carried the cold efficiency of a man who'd had this conversation many times before. Magdalena's blood turned to ice. Thomas had borrowed money to buy their land and start his lumber operation, but he'd promised the debt was manageable. What if he'd been wrong? What if there were other loans she didn't know about? She handed Rosa to the cradle and walked to the door, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. If Morrison wanted to talk business, she wouldn't hide like a frightened child. "Mr. Morrison," she said, stepping onto the porch. "I didn't expect to see you so soon after. My condolences on your loss, ma'am, but business waits for no one." Morrison's eyes were calculating as they took in her pale face and the way she gripped the porch railing for support. "Your husband owed the bank $300. With interest, that's grown to nearly $400 now." The number hit Magdalena like a physical blow. $400 was more money than she'd ever seen at one time. Thomas had told her they owed 50, maybe 75 at most. "That's impossible," she said weakly. Thomas said a lot of things. Promised he'd strike it rich with that timber claim, pay everything back with interest. Morrison pulled papers from his coat. "These say different. Signed contracts, Mrs. Reeves. Legal and binding." Elias stepped closer to Magdalena, his presence solid and reassuring. "What exactly are you asking for, Morrison? Payment in full by spring thaw or the land goes to auction. Simple business." Morrison's smile was thin and cold. "Of course, if Mrs. Reeves wants to discuss alternative arrangements." The way he said it made Magdalena's skin crawl. She'd heard stories about men like Morrison, who used desperate women's circumstances to their advantage. The thought of what he might consider alternative arrangements made her feel sick. "The land is all I have," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Without it, I have nothing." "Exactly my point. Best to settle this quickly, before things get more complicated." Morrison gathered his reins. "I'll give you until April to decide. After that, the law takes its course." As the three men rode away, Magdalena felt the world spinning around her. Everything Thomas had worked for, everything they'd planned to build together, it could all disappear because of debts she'd never known existed. $400, she whispered. "How could I possibly?" "Hey!" Elias's voice was gentle but firm. "Don't borrow trouble from tomorrow. We'll figure something out." "We?" Magdalena looked at him with surprise. "This isn't your problem." "Maybe not, but you're staying in my house, and your baby's sleeping in my son's cradle. That makes it my problem if I say it does." His gray eyes were steady and determined. "Besides, I know Morrison. He's a snake who preys on folks when they're down. I won't stand by and watch him destroy a woman with a newborn baby." Magdalena felt tears she'd been holding back finally spill over. For months, she'd carried every burden alone. Thomas's death, the pregnancy, the fear of winter, and now this crushing debt. Having someone willing to share the load felt like a miracle she didn't deserve. "Why would you help me?" she asked through her tears. Elias considered the question seriously. "Because 5 years ago, when I lost everything, no one was there to help. I know what it feels like to face ruin alone." He paused, looking toward the mountains where snow still fell steadily. "Maybe this is my chance to be the person I needed back then." 2 weeks later, Magdalena discovered that Elias Thornwood had secrets of his own. She was organizing his kitchen supplies while Rosa napped, trying to find ways to repay his kindness through useful work, when she found the letters hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She hadn't meant to pry. She'd only been looking for the source of a cold draft. But once she saw her own name written in unfamiliar handwriting, curiosity won over politeness. "Mrs. Magdalena Reeves," the letter began. "I am writing to inform you that your husband Thomas left detailed instructions regarding his debts and property. Please contact me immediately upon receipt of this message. Most urgent. Attorney Benjamin Walsh, Helena." The letter was dated 3 weeks before Thomas died. Magdalena's hands shook as she read it again. Why would Thomas contact a lawyer in Helena without telling her? And why was this letter hidden in Elias's cabin instead of delivered to her own home? Find something interesting? Magdalena spun around to find Elias standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She held up the letter with a mixture of anger and confusion. "This is addressed to me. Why do you have it?" Elias sighed and removed his hat, running fingers through his graying hair. "Because your husband asked me to keep it safe. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got it when you were ready to handle whatever it said." "Thomas knew you?" Magdalena's voice rose with disbelief. "But you acted like we were strangers when you found me in the storm." "We weren't strangers. We weren't close friends either, but Thomas and I did business together. He bought lumber from me for your cabin, and we talked sometimes when he came to pick up orders." Elias sat heavily in a kitchen chair. He was worried about something those last few months. Kept saying he needed to make sure you were protected if anything happened to him. Magdalena stared at the letter, her mind racing. Protected from what? I don't know. He never said exactly. But he gave me that letter and made me promise to look after you if trouble came. Elias met her eyes steadily. Said Morrison was circling like a vulture, looking for ways to steal your land. The betrayal hit Magdalena like a physical blow. For weeks, she'd been grateful to this man for saving her life, for opening his home to strangers out of pure kindness. Now she discovered it wasn't kindness at all. It was obligation. A promise made to her dead husband. So this whole time, you've been taking care of me because Thomas asked you to? Her voice was flat, emotionless. Not because you wanted to help, but because you felt you had to? It started that way, Elias admitted. But nothing. Magdalena folded the letter with sharp, angry movements. I thought you were being kind. I thought you cared about Rosa and me as people, not as some duty you inherited from my husband. That's not fair, Magdalena. Yes, I promised Thomas I'd help you if needed. But everything I've done since that night in the storm, that's been my choice. Magdalena wasn't listening anymore. She was thinking about all the moments that had felt real between them. His gentleness with Rosa, the way he'd shared stories about his own lost family, the protective anger in his voice when Morrison threatened her. Had any of it been genuine, or was it all just a man keeping his word to another man? I need to read this letter, she said coldly. Alone. Elias nodded and left the cabin without another word. Through the window, Magdalena watched him walk toward the barn. His shoulders bent as if carrying a heavy load. Part of her wanted to call him back, to hear his explanation. But the larger part felt betrayed by the discovery that her refuge had been built on obligation rather than compassion. She opened the letter with trembling fingers. The lawyer's message was brief but devastating. Thomas had indeed borrowed money from Morrison, not just the $400 the banker claimed, but nearly $1,000. However, he'd also taken out a life insurance policy that would pay twice that amount to his widow. The policy was being held in Helena, waiting for Magdalena to claim it. But there was a catch. The insurance company required proof that Thomas's death was accidental, not suicide. If they determined he'd taken his own life to provide for his family, the policy would be void. Magdalena sank into a chair, the letter falling from nerveless fingers. Thomas hadn't died in a riding accident. He'd been found at the bottom of Miller's Canyon with his horse, both of them broken on the rocks below. Everyone assumed the horse had spooked and gone over the edge. But what if Thomas had chosen to ride that dangerous path? What if he'd known exactly what would happen? The thought made her sick. Had her husband been so desperate to pay his debts and provide for their unborn child that he'd chosen death over dishonor? The insurance money would solve all her problems, but only if she could prove Thomas hadn't planned his own death. Outside, she heard Elias chopping wood with mechanical precision. Each blow of the axe sounded like an accusation. He'd known about the debts. He'd known Thomas was worried about something. Had he suspected the truth about that final ride to Miller's Canyon? Rosa began crying, and Magdalena moved automatically to comfort her daughter. As she lifted the baby, she realized that nothing had really changed. Insurance money or not, she still needed help. She still had nowhere else to go. And Elias, whatever his original motivations, had still saved both their lives. But trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. When Elias returned to the cabin that evening, he found Magdalena feeding Rosa by the fire. The letter lay open on the table between them like an accusation. "Did you know?" she asked without looking up. "About the insurance? I knew he'd arranged something. He never told me details." Elias hung his coat by the door and approached carefully, as if she might run. "Did you read what it says about proving his death was accidental?" "Yes." Magdalena's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think, could Thomas have?" "No." Elias's answer was immediate and firm. "I rode out to Miller's Canyon the day after it happened. Saw the tracks, the broken ground where his horse went over. That was an accident, Magdalena. A terrible, senseless accident. But the insurance company might not believe that. Then we'll make them believe it. We'll ride to Helena, talk to this lawyer, show them whatever proof they need." Elias paused. If you'll trust me to help you. Magdalena looked at him, then really looked at him. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the worry in his eyes, the way he held himself ready to accept whatever decision she made. He'd lied to her by omission, but he'd also saved her life and cared for her daughter. Maybe trust wasn't about perfect honesty. Maybe it was about choosing to believe in someone despite their flaws. "Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning?" she asked. "Because you were scared and hurt and alone with a newborn baby. You needed to heal, not worry about legal complications and insurance claims." Elias sat across from her, careful to maintain distance. "Maybe I was wrong to keep it from you, but I wanted you to have time to get strong before facing whatever Thomas left behind." It was a reasonable explanation, even a kind one, but it still stung to know that major decisions about her life had been made without her knowledge or consent. "If we're going to continue helping each other," Magdalena said slowly, "I need to know everything. No more secrets, no more decisions made for my own good. I'm stronger than you think." "Yes, you are," Elias agreed. "And I'm sorry I doubted that." As they sat in the firelight, with Rosa sleeping peacefully between them, Magdalena felt the first stirrings of something beyond gratitude or obligation. Despite the lies and complications, despite the uncertain future that lay ahead, she was beginning to care about this complicated man who'd brought them in from the storm. But caring about someone and trusting them were two different things. And trust, she was learning, had to be earned one honest conversation at a time. The gunshot cracked through the morning air like thunder, and Magdalena knew their peaceful days were over. She was hanging diapers on the line behind Elias's cabin when the sound echoed from the direction of her old homestead. Rosa began crying at the sharp noise, and Magdalena quickly gathered the baby close to her chest. Through the trees, she could see smoke rising, too much smoke for a normal cooking fire. Elias came running from the barn, his face grim. "Someone's at your place," he said, grabbing his rifle from inside the cabin. "That smoke's not natural." "Who would be there?" Magdalena asked, though she already suspected the answer. Only one person had reason to visit her abandoned homestead, and Samuel Morrison wasn't known for his patience. "Stay here with Rosa," Elias ordered, checking his weapon. "Lock the door and don't open it for anyone but me." But Magdalena was already wrapping the baby in warm blankets. "That's my home they're burning. I'm coming with you." "Magdalena, it's not safe." "Nothing's been safe since Thomas died." Her voice carried a strength that surprised them both. "If Morrison's destroying my property, I need to see it with my own eyes." The ride to her homestead felt like traveling back in time. Everything looked smaller than Magdalena remembered. The cabin where she'd given birth, the corral where Thomas had kept their horses, the small garden plot now buried under snow. But the most shocking change was the barn. Half of it lay in charred ruins, still smoking in the cold air. 3 men stood near the destruction, and Morrison's thin smile confirmed Magdalena's worst fears. He'd brought his usual companions, rough men who did whatever he asked without questions. The kind of men who wouldn't hesitate to burn a widow's property if it served their boss's purposes. "Mrs. Reeves," Morrison called cheerfully, as if they'd met by chance at a church social. "What a pleasant surprise. I was just inspecting your property." "By burning it down?" Elias's voice was dangerously quiet as he dismounted, keeping his rifle ready. "Terrible accident," Morrison replied with mock concern. "My men were checking the barn for structural damage when some old hay caught fire. These things happen when buildings aren't properly maintained." Magdalena stared at the ruins of the barn Thomas had built with his own hands. It had taken him 3 weeks of hard labor, working from dawn to dusk to give their animals proper shelter. Now it was nothing but ashes and broken dreams. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely controlled. "Why would you do this?" "Business, my dear. Pure business." Morrison's tone became serious. "You see, when property becomes worthless, debts become much harder to collect. Sometimes it's better to cut losses early." The meaning was clear. Morrison was sending a message. Pay what you owe, or watch everything you own burn to the ground. It was the kind of threat that worked on most frontier families, who couldn't afford to fight back against a man with money and connections. But Magdalena had spent weeks learning about courage from a man who'd faced his own losses with dignity. She climbed down from Elias's horse, still holding Rosa, and walked straight toward Morrison with steady steps. "You made a mistake," she said clearly. Morrison laughed. "What mistake is that? You assumed I was helpless." Magdalena's voice grew stronger with each word. "You thought a widow with a baby would be easy to scare, but you forgot something important." "And what's that?" "I've already lost everything that mattered most to me. My husband is dead. My home is burned. What else can you possibly take?" She stepped closer and Morrison actually took a step back. "But I know something you don't know. Something that changes everything." Morrison's confidence wavered slightly. "What are you talking about?" "Thomas had a life insurance policy. $1,000, Mr. Morrison. More than enough to pay his debts and buy this property back twice over." Magdalena's smile was cold as winter wind. "The insurance company in Helena is expecting me next week." The color drained from Morrison's face. He'd gambled on Magdalena being broke and desperate, easy to manipulate into surrendering her land for a fraction of its worth. An insurance payout would ruin all his plans. "Insurance policies can be complicated," Morrison said carefully. "Sometimes companies find reasons not to pay, especially when deaths seem suspicious." "Are you threatening to lie about how my husband died?" Magdalena's voice carried a new edge, one that made Morrison's men shift uncomfortably. "I'm simply saying that investigations can go in many directions, depending on what evidence comes to light." Morrison's threat was barely veiled now. He was suggesting he could manufacture proof that Thomas had killed himself, voiding the insurance policy. Elias stepped forward, his rifle now pointed directly at Morrison's chest. "That sounds like extortion to me, maybe even conspiracy to commit fraud." "You can't prove anything," Morrison sneered, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Maybe not, but I know someone who can." Magdalena pulled a folded paper from her coat, a letter she'd written the night before. "I've already contacted Sheriff Williams in Helena about your business practices. Told him about the suspicious fire, the threats, the attempts to manipulate insurance investigations. It was a bluff, but a convincing one." Morrison's face went from pale to red as he realized his position was weaker than he'd thought. He'd counted on intimidating a frightened widow, not fighting a woman who'd learned to stand up for herself. "This isn't over," Morrison said, mounting his horse. "You'll find that fighting me is more expensive than paying me." "Then I guess we'll see who has more to lose," Magdalena replied calmly. As Morrison and his men rode away, Elias lowered his rifle and looked at Magdalena with new respect. That was either very brave or very foolish. Probably both. Magdalena adjusted Rosa in her arms, trying to stop her hands from shaking now that the danger had passed. "But I meant what I said. I've lost too much already to be scared of losing more." They stood together in the ruins of her old life, watching smoke rise from the destroyed barn. But instead of feeling defeated, Magdalena felt something unexpected: relief. The confrontation with Morrison had forced her to find strength she didn't know she possessed. She wasn't the helpless widow he'd expected to intimidate. "What happens now?" Elias asked. "Now we go to Helena. We get that insurance money, and then we decide what comes next." Magdalena looked at the man who'd become so much more than just her protector. "Together, if you're willing." Elias smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since their argument about the hidden letter. "I'm willing." As they rode back toward his cabin, Magdalena realized that Morrison had actually done her a favor. By forcing her to fight, he'd helped her discover that she was no longer the frightened woman who'd given birth alone in a storm. She was someone stronger now, someone who could face whatever challenges lay ahead. But she also knew Morrison wouldn't give up easily. Men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully. The real battle was just beginning. The proposal came at dawn, whispered over coffee while Rosa slept peacefully in her cradle. "Marry me," Elias said quietly, his hands wrapped around his cup like it might provide courage. Not for love or romance, but for protection. Morrison can't touch a married woman's property the same way he can threaten a widow. Magdalena nearly choked on her coffee. After weeks of growing closer, learning to trust each other despite their complicated beginning, this was not how she'd imagined such a conversation might start. "A business arrangement?" she asked, setting down her cup with careful precision. "A partnership," Elias corrected. "You need legal protection and well, I've been alone too long. We work well together, Magdalena. We take care of each other, help each other through difficult times. Maybe that's enough foundation for a marriage." Outside, the Montana dawn painted the mountains in shades of pink and gold, but inside the cabin, the air felt charged with possibility and danger. Magdalena studied Elias's face, searching for clues about his true feelings. Was this really just about protecting her from Morrison? Or was there something deeper driving his proposal? "What about love?" she asked softly. "What about it? You loved Thomas and he died. I loved Maria and she died too. Love doesn't guarantee happiness or safety." Elias met her eyes directly. "But respect does. Trust does. Partnership does." It was a practical answer, the kind a sensible frontier woman should appreciate. Marriage for love was a luxury most people couldn't afford. Marriage for mutual benefit and companionship was common, even wise. But Magdalena found herself wanting more than practicality. "And if I say no? Then I'll still help you get to Helena, still stand with you against Morrison, still protect you and Rosa as long as you need me to." Elias's voice was steady, honest. "The offer doesn't come with threats or ultimatums. It's just an option." Before Magdalena could respond, Rosa began crying. Not the distressed wails of her early days, but the demanding cries of a healthy baby who expected her needs to be met promptly. As Magdalena lifted her daughter, she caught Elias watching them both with an expression that was definitely not businesslike. "You love her," Magdalena said suddenly. "Rosa, you love her like she was your own." Elias's weathered face softened. "Hard not to. She's got your stubborn streak and your courage. Plus, she's the first baby I've held since David died. Feels like getting a piece of my heart back." There it was, the real reason behind his proposal. Not just legal protection or practical partnership, but the chance to be a father again. And looking at the way Rosa reached for Elias when he spoke, Magdalena realized her daughter had already chosen him as family. "If we did this," she said carefully, "what would people say? A widow remarrying so quickly after her husband's death. Let them talk. People always find something to criticize." Elias stood and moved to the window, looking out at the mountains he'd called home for so many years. Besides, frontier life doesn't allow for long mourning periods. Survival comes first, society's opinions second. He was right, but Magdalena still felt the weight of judgment. In the civilized world, a woman was expected to grieve for at least a year before considering remarriage. But the Montana Territory wasn't civilized, and normal rules didn't always apply when survival was at stake. "There's something else," she said, her voice growing serious. "Morrison isn't just after my land. He's after yours too." Elias turned sharply. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about why he's so interested in my small homestead. It's not valuable enough to justify this much effort." Magdalena shifted Rosa to her other arm. "But combined with your property, it would control the entire valley. Someone could build a railroad spur, or establish a major lumber operation, or discover the silver deposits Thomas was always talking about," Elias finished grimly. "I thought he was just dreaming. But what if he wasn't?" The pieces were falling into place now. Morrison wasn't just a greedy banker. He was a man with bigger plans who needed their land to make those plans work. Marriage would complicate his schemes significantly, especially if both properties were jointly owned by a couple willing to fight back. "So this proposal isn't just about protecting me," Magdalena said. "It's about protecting both of us. Does that change your answer?" Magdalena considered the question seriously. Marriage to Elias would solve her immediate problems: legal protection, financial security, a father for Rosa. But it would also mean giving up any chance of finding the kind of love she'd shared with Thomas. Was safety worth that sacrifice? Then she looked at Elias, really looked at him. She saw the kindness in his eyes when he watched Rosa sleep. She remembered his gentle hands when her daughter couldn't breathe. She thought about the way he'd stood up to Morrison, the patient way he'd listened to her fears, the respect he'd shown for her strength even when she didn't believe in it herself. Maybe this wasn't the passionate romance of her youth, but it was something deeper, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine care. Maybe that was enough foundation for love to grow. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. But not just for protection or business." Magdalena stood and moved closer to him. "I'll marry you because I think we could build something good together. Something real." Elias's smile was like sunrise after a long winter night. "When?" "Soon. Before Morrison has time to cause more trouble." Magdalena paused, suddenly nervous. "But Elias? I need you to know that I cared about Thomas, and I always will. If we do this, you'll be marrying a woman with ghosts." "We all have ghosts, Magdalena. The question is whether we let them haunt us or help us appreciate what we have now." He reached out and touched her face gently. "I'm not asking you to forget Thomas. I'm asking you to choose a future that honors his memory while still allowing yourself to be happy." It was exactly the right thing to say. Magdalena felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally spill over. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief. She wasn't betraying Thomas's memory by choosing to move forward. She was honoring it by refusing to let grief destroy the family he died trying to protect. "Then let's go to town today," she said, wiping her eyes. "Get the preacher to marry us before we head to Helena. Face everything else as husband and wife." As they began making plans, Rosa gurgled happily in her mother's arms, as if she approved of the arrangement. Outside, the Montana sun climbed higher over mountains that had witnessed countless stories of survival and second chances. Magdalena was about to become part of that tradition. A woman who'd found love twice, lost it once, and chosen to risk her heart again on the promise of partnership and hope. It wasn't the ending she'd planned when she'd married Thomas, but it might be exactly the beginning she needed. The wedding ring slipped from Magdalena's trembling fingers and rolled across the church floor, spinning like a coin before settling near the altar steps. Pastor Williams looked up from his prayer book with concern as Elias quickly retrieved the simple gold band. Around them, the small wooden church in Copper Falls seemed to hold its breath. Even Rosa, usually fussy during quiet moments, remained silent in the arms of Mrs. Patterson, the pastor's wife who'd agreed to serve as witness. "Are you all right, my dear?" the pastor asked gently. Magdalena nodded, though her face had gone pale. This was really happening. In a few minutes, she'd be Mrs. Elias Thornwood instead of Mrs. Thomas Reeves. Part of her felt like she was betraying everything she'd built with her first husband, even though her mind knew this marriage was the right choice. "Just nervous," she managed to say. Elias stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "We can wait if you need more time," he said quietly, meant only for her ears. "No." Magdalena's voice grew stronger. "I want to do this. I need to do this." The ceremony resumed, but it was interrupted again by the sound of horses approaching fast. Through the church windows, they could see riders dismounting outside, too many riders for a peaceful visit. "Expecting company, Pastor?" Elias asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "Not today." Pastor Williams frowned as heavy boots stomped up the church steps. "This is supposed to be a private ceremony." The church doors burst open, and Samuel Morrison strode in with 3 armed men behind him. His face was flushed with anger and something that looked like desperation. Behind him came a stranger, a well-dressed man with a badge pinned to his vest. "Stop this wedding," Morrison demanded. "I have legal grounds to prevent this marriage." "On what authority?" Pastor Williams asked, straightening to his full height despite being outnumbered. The stranger with the badge stepped forward. "Deputy Marshal Johnson from Helena. I have a warrant for Mrs. Reeves' arrest on charges of insurance fraud and conspiracy." Magdalena felt the world tilt sideways. "That's impossible. I haven't done anything wrong." According to Mr. Morrison's investigation, You and your late husband conspired to fake his death for insurance money. He claims to have evidence that Thomas Reeves is still alive and hiding in Canada. The accusation was so outrageous that Magdalena almost laughed. Almost. But the deputy's serious expression and Morrison's satisfied smile told her this was no joke. Somehow, Morrison had convinced a federal marshal that Thomas had faked his own death. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," Elias said angrily. "I saw Thomas Reeves' body myself. Helped carry him to the cemetery. This is harassment, pure and simple." "Then you won't mind if Mrs. Reeves comes with me to Helena for questioning," Deputy Johnson replied. "If she's innocent, the investigation will clear her name. And if she's guilty," Morrison added with obvious satisfaction, "the insurance policy is void and her debts remain unpaid. Either way, this wedding is postponed indefinitely." Magdalena realized the trap Morrison had set. Even if the charges were eventually dropped, the investigation could take months. During that time, she'd have no legal protection as Elias's wife, and Morrison could seize her property for debt payment. It was a clever, vicious plan. "I'm not going anywhere without proof of these charges," she said firmly. Deputy Johnson pulled out official-looking papers. Sworn testimony from 3 witnesses claiming they saw Thomas Reeves alive in Fort Benton last month. Testimony from a hotel clerk who says a man matching his description checked in under a false name. "Paid testimony," Elias said flatly. "Morrison's bought himself some liars." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Thornwood. Do you have proof of bribery?" Before Elias could answer, a new voice spoke from the back of the church. "Actually, I do." Everyone turned to see Jacob Whitmore standing in the doorway, but he wasn't alone. With him was a tall, dark-haired man who looked vaguely familiar to Magdalena. Behind them stood Sheriff Williams from Helena, the real Sheriff Williams, not Morrison's bought deputy. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Williams said pleasantly, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Deputy Johnson here isn't actually a federal marshal anymore. He was dismissed from service last week for accepting bribes." Morrison's face went white. "That's impossible. I checked his credentials myself." "You checked forged credentials?" the dark-haired stranger said, stepping into the church. "Credentials I helped him create in exchange for information about your activities, Mr. Morrison." Magdalena stared at the man, recognition finally dawning. He had Thomas's build, Thomas's coloring, but his face was different, scarred and weathered in ways her husband's had never been. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Nathan Reeves," the man replied gently. "Thomas's older brother. The one everyone thought died in the war." The revelation hit the church like a thunderbolt. Magdalena had heard about Nathan, Thomas's beloved brother who'd supposedly been killed at Gettysburg. But here he stood, very much alive, and apparently working to expose Morrison's schemes. "But Thomas said you were dead," Magdalena said, her voice barely audible. "Thomas thought I was dead. Everyone did. I was captured, spent 3 years in a Confederate prison camp, and when I finally escaped, I decided it was easier to stay dead than come home to a world that had moved on without me." Nathan's eyes were sad but kind. "I've been living in Canada working as a trapper, but when I heard about Thomas's real death, I came south to make sure his family was protected." Morrison was backing toward the door, but Sheriff Williams blocked his path. "Samuel Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, attempted extortion, and bribery of federal officials." "You can't prove any of this," Morrison snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, we can." Jacob pulled out a small notebook. "I've been keeping track of your activities for weeks. Every bribe you paid, every threat you made, every law you broke. Nathan here helped me gather evidence while pretending to be the mysterious Thomas Reeves your witnesses claimed to see." The pieces fell into place for Magdalena. Nathan had deliberately let himself be seen around Fort Benton, knowing Morrison's spies would report a Thomas lookalike to their boss. It was an elaborate trap, and Morrison had walked right into it. "The insurance investigation is closed," Sheriff Williams announced. "Thomas Reeves died accidentally, exactly as originally reported. The insurance company will pay Mrs. Reeves the full amount, plus damages for the harassment she's endured. As Morrison was led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence, the church fell silent except for Rosa's happy babbling. The immediate crisis was over, but Magdalena felt overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "So," Pastor Williams said after clearing his throat, "shall we continue with the wedding?" Magdalena looked at Elias, who was watching her with patient understanding. Then she looked at Nathan, the brother-in-law she'd never expected to meet. Finally, she looked at Rosa, who was reaching for Elias with complete trust. "Yes," she said firmly. "Let's finish what we started." This time, when Elias placed the ring on her finger, her hands were steady. This time, when she promised to love and honor him, the words felt like a new beginning rather than a betrayal of the past. And when Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Magdalena felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Hope for a future that held more joy than sorrow. Outside the church, Nathan approached her with hesitation. "I know this is overwhelming," he said. "I don't expect anything from you, Magdalena. I just wanted to make sure Morrison couldn't hurt Thomas's family." "Your family too," she replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Rosa should know her uncle, and I'd like to hear stories about Thomas that only his brother would know." Nathan's smile was exactly like Thomas's, and for the first time since her husband's death, remembering didn't hurt quite so much. 6 months later, Magdalena stood in the garden behind the expanded cabin, watching Rosa take her first wobbly steps toward Elias, who waited with arms outstretched and a smile that could have powered the whole territory. "Come on, little one," he encouraged. "You can do it." Rosa giggled and lurched forward, managing 3 whole steps before sitting down hard in the dirt. But instead of crying, she clapped her hands and looked around as if expecting applause for her achievement. "She's definitely got the Thornwood stubbornness," Nathan called from where he was splitting firewood nearby. He decided to stay in Montana rather than return to Canada, building his own small cabin on the far end of their expanded property. "Takes after her new papa." Magdalena smiled at the easy way Nathan had accepted Elias as Rosa's father. The 3 adults had found a comfortable rhythm over the past months. Not quite a family in the traditional sense, but something that worked for all of them. Nathan provided stories about Thomas that helped keep his memory alive, while Elias provided the steady presence Rosa needed as she grew. The insurance money had solved their immediate problems, but the real victory had been Morrison's downfall. The crooked banker was now serving time in the territorial prison, and his associates had scattered to avoid similar fates. Word had spread throughout the territory about what happened to men who preyed on widows and orphans. It was a lesson that would be remembered for years. "Magdalena," Elias called from inside the cabin. "Come see this." She found him at the kitchen table, reading a letter with obvious excitement. Rosa crawled over to investigate, pulling herself up on his legs with determined effort. "What is it?" Magdalena asked. "Letter from the territorial capital. They're offering me a contract to supply lumber for the new courthouse they're building in Helena. It's enough work to keep us busy for 2 years, maybe more." The opportunity was enormous, the kind of contract that could establish Elias as one of the territory's major lumber suppliers. But it would also mean spending weeks at a time away from home, supervising crews and managing the complex logistics of such a large project. "That's wonderful news," Magdalena said, though she felt a flutter of worry. "When would you need to start?" "Next month." "But Magdalena," Elias set down the letter and reached for her hands. "I wouldn't take this if you weren't comfortable with me being away so much. We're partners in this marriage, which means we make big decisions together." It was exactly the kind of consideration Thomas had never shown her. Her first husband had been a good man, but he'd made decisions about their future without asking her opinion. Elias was different. He genuinely valued her thoughts and wouldn't move forward without her blessing. "What do you think we should do?" she asked. "I think we should take the contract, but only if you and Rosa come with me for part of the time. Helena's got schools, doctors, supplies we can't get out here. It might be good for Rosa to see more of the world." The suggestion surprised Magdalena. She'd grown comfortable in their isolated valley, content with the rhythm of rural life. But Elias was right. Rosa would benefit from exposure to the larger world beyond their homestead. What about Nathan and the property here? Nathan can manage things while we're gone. He knows the land as well as I do now, and he's been talking about starting his own trapping business anyway. Elias paused thoughtfully. Besides, this contract would give us enough money to really expand. We could build a proper house, maybe buy more land, establish ourselves as one of the territory's leading families. It was an attractive vision: prosperity, security, and social standing. All the things Thomas had dreamed of but never achieved. But Magdalena found herself thinking about the deeper changes such success might bring. Would we still be us? She asked quietly. Would we still be the people who fell in love over morning coffee and evening conversations? Elias considered the question seriously. I think that depends on us. Money and status can change people, but only if they let it. What matters most to you, Magdalena? What kind of life do you want for Rosa? She looked around the cabin they'd expanded together, room by room, as their family had grown. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it was theirs. Every board, every nail, every piece of furniture told the story of their partnership. I want Rosa to understand that happiness doesn't come from having the most of anything, the biggest house, the finest clothes, the most money. I want her to know that real wealth is having people who love you and work you can be proud of. Then we'll take the Helena contract, but we'll stay ourselves, Elias said firmly. We'll use the money to build something lasting, not just something impressive. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Rosa pulled herself upright using Elias's leg and took 2 more unsteady steps toward Magdalena. This time, she made it all the way across the kitchen before sitting down with a proud grin. Look at that, Nathan said from the doorway, where he'd been watching unnoticed. Walking before her first birthday, Thomas would have been so proud. The mention of her first husband's name no longer brought pain, just a warm recognition of the love that had started this journey. Magdalena had learned that grief wasn't something you got over. It was something you carried with you, like a precious stone that grew smoother with time but never lost its value. He would have loved her so much, she agreed softly. He does love her, Elias said, his voice gentle but certain. Love doesn't die just because people do. It gets passed on, generation to generation, person to person. Thomas's love for you became part of your love for Rosa. And now it's part of my love for both of you. It was a beautiful thought, and one that felt true in ways Magdalena was still discovering. She'd learned that hearts were bigger than she'd imagined, capable of holding multiple loves without diminishing any of them. Her love for Thomas existed alongside her growing love for Elias, just as Rosa's biological connection to Thomas coexisted with her deep bond with the man she called Papa. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the Montana mountains, Magdalena reflected on how much had changed since that desperate night when Rosa was born. She'd started as a woman alone, terrified and helpless. Now she was part of a family, unconventional perhaps, but strong and loving and committed to each other's happiness. What are you thinking about? Elias asked, following her gaze toward the distant peaks. Second chances, she replied. How sometimes the life you end up with is better than the one you planned. Even though it's harder to find? Especially because it's harder to find. The easy things don't teach you much about yourself. It's the difficult paths that show you how strong you really are. As if in agreement, Rosa clapped her hands from her blanket on the porch floor, then crawled determinedly toward the steps. Elias quickly scooped her up before she could tumble down. Easy there, explorer, he said with a laugh. Save some adventure for when you're older. But Magdalena suspected that Rosa would never be short on adventure. She was growing up in a family that had faced crisis and emerged stronger, in a territory where courage and determination mattered more than social conventions. Most importantly, she was surrounded by adults who understood that love was not a limited resource, but an endless gift that grew larger when shared. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly around them, full of beauty and danger and infinite possibility. It was exactly the right place for a family that had learned to find hope in unexpected places and strength in each other's hearts. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning that would change everything, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered with sweat from the urgent journey from town. Magdalena was teaching 2-year-old Rosa to count using wooden blocks that Nathan had carved when she heard the approaching hoofbeats. Through the window, she watched Elias emerge from the lumber mill he'd built behind their house, wiping sawdust from his hands as the messenger dismounted. "Telegram for Mrs. Thornwood," the young man called, holding up the yellow paper like it contained either treasure or disaster. Magdalena's stomach clenched. In 1869, telegrams rarely brought good news to frontier families. She hurried outside with Rosa on her hip, arriving just as Elias finished reading the message. His face had gone pale beneath his work-weathered tan. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "It's from Helena. The territorial governor wants to see us. All of us." Elias handed her the telegram, his voice tight with worry. "Says it's urgent and concerns Rosa's legal status." Magdalena read the brief message twice, her heart sinking with each word. Legal status. Those 2 words could mean only one thing. Someone was questioning Rosa's parentage or Elias's right to adopt her. But who would raise such questions now, 2 years after their marriage? Could Morrison have arranged this somehow? She asked. From prison. Morrison's still locked up, and most of his associates left the territory. Nathan appeared from behind the house, where he'd been checking their newest logging equipment. But men like him have long reaches and longer memories. The messenger cleared his throat apologetically. "Beggin' your pardon, ma'am, but I was told to wait for a reply. The governor's expecting you in Helena within the week." A week. Barely enough time to arrange their affairs and make the 3-day journey to the territorial capital. Magdalena looked at Rosa, who was babbling happily and pulling at her mother's hair, completely unaware that adult complications were threatening to disrupt her peaceful world. "We'll be there," Elias told the messenger firmly. "Tell the governor we'll arrive Friday morning." After the rider left, the 3 adults stood in uncomfortable silence. They'd built such a good life here. Elias's lumber business was thriving, Nathan's trapping enterprise was growing, and Rosa was developing into a bright, curious child who knew she was loved by everyone around her. Now some distant bureaucrat wanted to examine their family arrangements like specimens under a microscope. "Maybe it's not as bad as we think," Magdalena said without much conviction. "Maybe it's just routine paperwork." "Since when is anything involving the territorial government routine?" Nathan asked grimly. "Someone's stirring up trouble, and they've convinced important people to pay attention." That evening, as they prepared for the trip to Helena, Magdalena found herself studying Rosa with new eyes. Her daughter had Thomas's dark hair and stubborn chin, but her smile was pure joy, the smile of a child who'd never doubted her place in the world. What would happen to that innocent confidence if some judge or bureaucrat decided that Elias wasn't her real father? "She belongs with us," Magdalena said fiercely as she packed Rosa's clothes. "No matter what any law says, she belongs with us." "I know." Elias was cleaning his good suit, the one he'd worn to their wedding. "But knowing what's right and convincing government officials are 2 different things." "What's the worst they can do?" Magdalena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "They could rule that the adoption isn't legal because Rosa wasn't properly orphaned, that since you remarried so quickly, there wasn't sufficient evidence of abandonment or need." Elias's voice was carefully controlled. "They could say she needs to be placed with blood relatives, or in an official orphanage until her status is clarified." The thought of losing Rosa made Magdalena feel physically sick. This child was everything to her. Not just a link to Thomas's memory, but a vibrant, irreplaceable person who'd brought light back into her life after the darkest period she'd ever known. "Over my dead body," she said quietly. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." Nathan had appeared in the doorway, his face serious. "I've been thinking about this situation, and I have an idea. It's not perfect, but it might help." "What kind of idea?" Elias asked. "What if I claim Rosa as my niece? As Thomas's brother, I'd have more legal standing than either of you in some court's eyes. If I petition for custody and then immediately sign guardianship over to you both, It might satisfy whatever legal requirements are causing problems. It was a clever solution, but one that required Nathan to take significant risks. If the plan backfired, he could find himself legally responsible for Rosa while being separated from the only parents she'd ever really known. "That's asking too much," Magdalena protested. "You'd be gambling your freedom and future on legal technicalities." "Rosa's my family too," Nathan replied simply. "Thomas would have done the same for my children if our situations were reversed." The Helena they arrived in 5 days later was bustling with activity. The territorial capital had grown dramatically since Magdalena's last visit, with new buildings rising on every street and crowds of people pursuing the business of government and commerce. It was exciting and overwhelming, especially for Rosa, who pressed her face against the hotel window and pointed at every horse, carriage, and interesting passerby. Their appointment with Territorial Governor Benjamin Potts was scheduled for 10 o'clock Saturday morning in the imposing stone building that housed the territorial government offices. Magdalena had dressed Rosa in her finest dress, blue cotton with white lace trim that she'd sewn herself, while Elias wore his wedding suit and Nathan had purchased new clothes for the occasion. "Remember," Elias said as they climbed the steps to the governor's office, "we're not asking for favors. We're simply clarifying the legal status of our family." But when they were ushered into the governor's office, they discovered they weren't the only people interested in Rosa's legal status. Sitting across from Governor Potts was a well-dressed woman with iron-gray hair and cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornwood," Governor Potts said politely, "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Constance Hartford. She represents the Territorial Children's Welfare Society." Mrs. Hartford stood and examined Rosa with the clinical interest of someone evaluating livestock. "So this is the child in question. She appears healthy enough, though I notice some concerning behavioral patterns." "What kind of patterns?" Magdalena asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Excessive attachment to non-biological caregivers. Lack of proper feminine deportment for a child her age. Signs that she's been allowed to develop too much independence and willfulness." Mrs. Hartford's tone suggested these were serious character flaws. "These issues are common in children raised without proper oversight." Rosa, apparently sensing the woman's disapproval, moved closer to Elias and wrapped her small arms around his leg. The gesture was so natural, so full of trust and affection, that it spoke louder than any legal document about where she belonged. "Mrs. Hartford has raised concerns about the circumstances of your marriage and adoption," Governor Potts explained. "She believes Rosa would be better served in a more traditional family environment." "What's more traditional than a loving mother and father?" Nathan asked, speaking for the first time. "A family where the child's biological heritage is properly acknowledged and where she can be raised according to appropriate social standards," Mrs. Hartford replied crisply. "I've identified a suitable family in Denver. Prominent citizens who specifically requested a young girl to complete their household." The meaning was clear. Mrs. Hartford wanted to take Rosa away from the only family she'd ever known and give her to strangers who viewed children as accessories to enhance their social standing. Magdalena felt something fierce and protective rise within her, the same feeling that had given her strength to face Morrison, to survive childbirth alone, to rebuild her life from nothing. This bureaucratic vulture might have official authority, but she had something more powerful. A mother's love and a mother's determination to protect her child. "No," she said simply. "I'm afraid this isn't a matter of your preferences, Mrs. Thornwood," Mrs. Hartford replied. "The territorial government has an obligation to ensure all children are properly." "I said no." Magdalena's voice cut through the woman's speech like steel through silk. "Rosa is my daughter. Elias is her father. Nathan is her uncle. We are her family, and no one, not you, not the government, not anyone, is going to take her away from us." The room fell silent except for Rosa's happy babbling as she played with the buttons on Elias's jacket, completely oblivious to the adult drama swirling around her. In that moment, Magdalena realized that this confrontation wasn't really about legal technicalities or social standards. It was about something much more fundamental, the right of a family to define itself. 25 years after that confrontation in the governor's office, Magdalena Thornwood stood in her garden, watching her granddaughter chase butterflies while Rosa, now a married woman with children of her own, hung laundry on the line. The final battle for Rosa's custody had lasted 3 more hours in that government office, with lawyers and witnesses and enough legal documents to fill a small trunk. In the end, it was Nathan's military service record and Elias's growing reputation as a successful businessman that had tipped the scales in their favor. Mrs. Hartford had left Helena empty-handed, muttering about irregular families and declining moral standards. But more importantly, it was Rosa herself who had won the day. When Governor Potts had asked her, in simple words a 2-year-old could understand, who her family was, she had pointed confidently at Magdalena, Elias, and Nathan and said, "Mama, Papa, Uncle," with such certainty that even the most skeptical bureaucrat couldn't deny where her heart belonged. "Grandmama," 4-year-old Emma called, running toward her with a handful of wildflowers. "Look what I found." Magdalena knelt to examine the bouquet, marveling at how this new generation took for granted the stability that had been so hard-won. Emma knew nothing about custody battles or legal challenges. She only knew that she was surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. "They're beautiful, sweetheart," Magdalena said, accepting the flowers with appropriate solemnity. "Should we put them in water for your mama?" "Yes, and save some for Papa Elias when he comes home." Papa Elias. Even after all these years, hearing Rosa's children use that title for the man who'd raised her filled Magdalena with quiet satisfaction. Elias had officially adopted Rosa when she turned 5, in a simple ceremony that made legal what had always been true in their hearts. By then, Rosa called him Papa so naturally that no one questioned the arrangement. Rosa approached with her laundry basket, moving with the confident grace of a woman who'd never doubted her place in the world. At 27, she was a respected member of their community, married to a good man who owned the largest general store in Copper Falls. She had 3 children of her own and was expecting a 4th. "Any word from Uncle Nathan?" Rosa asked, settling beside her mother on the garden bench they'd built together years ago. "Letter came yesterday. He's doing well in Seattle. Says the fishing business is better than he expected." Magdalena smiled at the memory of Nathan's latest adventure. At 55, Thomas's brother had finally found love with a widow who owned a boarding house near the waterfront. He'll be back for Emma's birthday next month. The extended family Nathan had chosen to stay part of continued to gather for important occasions, even as they scattered across the growing West. It was a family defined by choice rather than blood, held together by shared experiences rather than shared names. In many ways, it was stronger than traditional families because everyone had actively chosen to belong. "Mama," Rosa said suddenly, using the serious tone that meant she had something important to discuss. "I've been thinking about the new schoolteacher they're hiring for next year." "What about her?" "She's young, unmarried, and she'll need a place to stay. I thought maybe she could board with you and Papa. The house is so quiet now with just the 2 of you." Magdalena considered the suggestion. Their home had indeed grown quiet since Rosa married and moved to town. Elias still worked every day, but at 62, he wasn't taking on the enormous contracts that had once required months away from home. They had more space and resources than they needed, and helping a young woman start her career would be deeply satisfying. "I'll discuss it with your father," she said, then caught herself using the term that had become natural over the years. Elias was Papa to Rosa and Grandpapa to the children, but to Magdalena, he was simply the man who'd shared her life for 25 years of marriage. "You still call him that?" Rosa observed with amusement. "After all this time, you still get that look when you talk about Papa." "What look?" "The look that says you still can't quite believe how lucky you got." Magdalena laughed, but there was truth in Rosa's observation. Even after a quarter-century of marriage, she sometimes woke up surprised to find herself in a warm bed beside a man who'd kept every promise he'd ever made to her. Their love had grown slowly, like a tree putting down deep roots, until it became the foundation everything else was built on. "I suppose I am lucky," she admitted. "We both are. Your father, Elias, he could have had an easier life if he'd stayed alone. Instead, he chose to help a desperate woman and her baby, and somehow that choice led to all this." She gestured around the garden, Toward the house they'd expanded room by room as their prosperity grew. Toward the town that had developed partly because of Elias's lumber business. Toward the family that had grown from crisis into something beautiful and enduring. "Do you ever think about my birth father?" Rosa asked quietly. "About Thomas?" It was a question Rosa had asked occasionally over the years, usually during moments of quiet reflection like this one. Magdalena had always answered honestly, sharing memories of Thomas that honored his place in their family history without diminishing Elias's role as Rosa's real father. "Every day," Magdalena replied, "but not with sadness anymore. I think about how proud he would be of the woman you've become, of the family we've built, of the way his love for us became part of something larger. I wish I could have known him." "You do know him. Every time you stand up for what's right, that's Thomas's stubbornness. Every time you refuse to give up on something important, that's his determination. Every time you show kindness to someone who needs help, that's his generous heart." Magdalena reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "The best parts of him live on in you." As the afternoon sun slanted through the trees, painting everything in golden light, Magdalena reflected on the journey that had brought them to this peaceful moment. She'd started as a frightened girl who thought love came only once in a lifetime. She'd learned that hearts were bigger than she'd imagined, capable of holding multiple loves without diminishing any of them. The sound of a wagon approaching interrupted her thoughts. Through the trees, she could see Elias returning from town, probably with supplies for the new addition they were planning to build. At 62, he was still strong and vital, still the steady presence that had anchored their family through every storm. "There's Papa now," Rosa said, gathering up her children. "We should head home before dinner." As the family prepared to scatter to their respective homes, Magdalena felt the deep contentment that came from watching a day end well. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did in frontier life. But tonight there was peace, prosperity, and the knowledge that they'd built something lasting together. Elias appeared around the corner of the house, his face lighting up when he saw the group in the garden. After 25 years of marriage, he still looked at Magdalena like she was the best surprise of his day. "How are my girls?" he asked, gathering Emma into a hug while nodding affectionately at Rosa and Magdalena. "We're perfect, Grandpapa," Emma announced with the confidence of a child who'd never known anything but love and security. And looking around at the family they'd built from the ashes of loss and the courage to try again, Magdalena had to agree. They were, in all the ways that mattered, absolutely perfect. The Montana mountains stood eternal around them, witness to countless stories of survival and redemption. But this story, their story, was one of the fortunate few that had found its way not just to survival, but to genuine happiness. In a land where winter could last half the year and nothing was ever guaranteed, they had discovered that the human heart was capable of miracles, if only one had the courage to believe in second chances and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the best families were the ones you chose for yourself.